the clang of metal trays, the smell of boiled veg drifting down the corridor, and that familiar thwack as something unidentifiable landed on your plate with a ladle. If you remember that, you're already halfway back to itchy uniforms, noisy dining halls, and a menu that never seemed to change. But somehow, we all remember it. British school dinners weren't fancy, but they were unforgettable. Some made us wince, others made us grin, and whether you loved or hated them, they stuck with you. It came out steaming, a big ladleful dropped onto your tray with a sloppy splat, golden mash swirled with salty chunks of corned beef, sometimes dotted with flecks of onion or carrot if you were lucky. It wasn't pretty, but it was hot, hearty, and stuck to your ribs. Corned beef hash was the school dinner workhorse. Simple ingredients, cheap to make in bulk, and always guaranteed to fill the hall with that unmistakable smell. Rich, meaty, and just a bit tinny. You'd sit there in the noise of the lunch hall, fork in hand, poking through the mash to find the best bits, the crispy edge pieces if you were lucky, or that one corner where the beef had caramelized slightly from the oven tray. For some, it was comfort, for others, survival. But either way, it kept you going till home time. And there was something about it, the way it arrived without fuss, without garnish, just a scoop of warmth on a cold day, that made it feel like more than just food. It was reliable, it was familiar, and it tasted like effort, like someone, somewhere, had stirred it by hand. Maybe you hated it then. Maybe you scraped it off into the bin when no one was watching. But now, you'd give a lot to sit at that long, laminated table again, just once, and smell it drifting from the kitchen hatch. It looked like something out of a dream or a laboratory, a thick square of golden sponge, still warm from the oven, drowned in a pool of custard the color of bubblegum. Pink custard. No one really knew what it was made from. It didn't taste of strawberries or raspberries or anything found in nature, but it was glorious. Sweet, smooth, and slightly surreal. The sponge was soft but dense, soaked just enough to carry the custard without collapsing. On top, sometimes a drizzle of red jam, sharp and sticky, that bled into the sponge like edible lava. And if you got to the front of the line early, you might even get the corner piece, with the crispiest edge and the most custard. It wasn't fancy, but it felt special. A dessert that made up for mushy peas or soggy cabbage, a sugary reward for surviving double maths. And for some of us, it was the first thing we ever truly looked forward to at school. The moment the dinner lady tilted that jug and poured, the hall went quiet for a second, just long enough to admire the pink tide. Today, it's hard to explain to anyone who didn't grow up with it. It wasn't gourmet, it wasn't even logical, but it was ours. Childhood on a tray, a sweet, strange, unforgettable mess, and one you secretly hoped would never change. It arrived in a shallow bowl, steaming faintly, pale as porridge but thicker, smoother. Semolina. Just the name alone brings back memories. Some adored it, others dreaded it, but no one forgets it. The texture was soft, almost gloopy, but with a gentle graininess that clung to your spoon and your teeth. And then the swirl, a bright red ribbon of raspberry syrup twirled across the top like someone had tried to make it fancy. You'd watch it bleed into the pudding, turning the white pink, spreading slowly like a sunset. The first spoonful was cautious, warm, creamy, a little bland until you hit the syrup, sharp and sweet like a surprise in the middle of something plain. For some kids, semolina was comfort, a hug in a bowl. For others, it was punishment, endured in silence with eyes fixed on the clock. But whether you loved it or loathed it, it said something about the time, about simplicity, about finding joy in small, repetitive things. You might not have known where semolina came from or why they served it so often, but there it was, again and again, familiar, reliable, and strangely grounding. Years later, you might find yourself stirring a saucepan, watching the swirl of jam in something warm and white, and you'll be back there. Plastic bowl, metal spoon, the buzz of the lunch hall, and a quiet moment with a dish that meant far more than it should have. You could smell it before you saw it, the thick, metallic scent of liver drifting down the corridor like a warning. Some kids turned right back around. Others sighed and shuffled forward, trays in hand, resigned to their fate. Liver and onions, the school dinner villain. Dark, dense slices of offal, slick with gravy and topped with slippery, translucent onions. It looked like a dare. It tasted like something grown-ups insisted was good for you. For many, it was the line in the sand. You either braved it or found a clever way to hide it under mash. But for a few, just a few, it was a badge of honor. "You finished yours?" someone would ask, amazed. And if you had, you were legendary. There was something old-fashioned about liver. It felt like a meal from a different era, something post-war and practical. It wasn't about pleasure. It was about building backbone, teaching resilience, and reminding you that not every meal was meant to be loved. Still, there was a strange respect for it. Even if you hated it, you remembered it. The tray, the steam, the silent negotiation in your head as you sliced a piece and hoped the gravy would help. Liver and onions may have been dreaded, but it left a mark. And looking back, maybe it wasn't just about eating something you didn't like. Maybe it was about learning that sometimes the hardest things leave the strongest memories. It shimmered under the canteen lights, a glossy, golden surface that looked almost too perfect to touch. Butterscotch tart. Just the name still feels like a treat. A soft, caramel custard filling nestled in a crumbly short crust base, sliced into neat triangles that never seemed to last long enough. If you were lucky, you got to the front of the queue before it ran out, and that was a victory. It wasn't served every week. Some terms, it didn't appear at all. But when it did, it was cause for celebration. Kids whispered about it. Eyes scanned the trays in hope. The texture was smooth and rich, melting on your tongue in waves of brown sugar and butter. It tasted like something far too indulgent for a school tray, yet somehow it was ours, served with a quiet wink from the dinner lady who knew how rare it was. There was no fancy garnish, no ice cream or custard on the side. It didn't need it. Butterscotch tart stood on its own, confident, classic, unforgettable, and the memory of it still lingers. Not just the taste, but the moment. That feeling of something special, unexpected and sweet. In a world of grey mash and overcooked veg, butterscotch tart was a beam of sunshine, a reminder that even in the most ordinary school week, joy could come in a perfect slice. They didn't look natural. Twisted spirals of reconstituted turkey, breaded and baked until they curled like a spring. But to a generation of school kids, turkey twizzlers were more than just food. They were a movement, a crunchy, spicy, slightly mysterious treat that turned an ordinary lunch tray into something exciting. When they appeared on the menu, you knew it was going to be a good day. They sizzled as they came out of the oven, the coating golden, the inside steaming. Some kids ate them slowly, uncoiling each bite like a prized sweet. Others bit straight through, no time to waste. They were salty, savory, and packed with flavor, even if nobody quite knew what was in them. And then, just like that, they were gone. One day, they were part of the weekly rotation. The next, banned, headlines, health debates, Jamie Oliver. Suddenly, the thing we loved was the thing grown-ups feared. Turkey twizzlers became a symbol of freedom, of childhood, of the never-ending tug-of-war between fun and nutrition. But no amount of controversy could erase the memory, because when you're 10 years old and lunch is usually a beige mountain of mash and peas, something like a Twizzler sticks in your mind, in your taste buds, in your story. You didn't just eat them, you remember them. They came as a pair, like it or not, a scoop of green peas rolling loose across your tray, and beside them a pile of mash that was more lump than potato. Green peas and lumpy mash, the unsung sidekicks of nearly every school dinner. No matter what the main dish was, odds were these two showed up like clockwork. The peas were often dull, slightly wrinkled, and somehow both wet and dry. They escaped your fork, rolled across the tray, and sometimes even made it onto the floor. As for the mash, it had a texture all its own, part smooth, part surprise. Some bites were fluffy, Others had tiny potato rocks lurking inside, but they did their job. They filled the space. They made the meat go further. They soaked up gravy. And for all their flaws, they were familiar, predictable, a constant in a chaotic lunchroom. Maybe you complained. Maybe you traded them off to a friend with less pickiness and more appetite. But deep down, you knew they were part of the ritual, part of the deal, and now, strangely, part of the memory. You can still picture the tray, the plastic cutlery struggling to catch a pea, the way the mash held its shape like a tiny beige mountain. No one ever asked for seconds, but no one ever forgot them either. Because sometimes the things you remember most aren't the best. They're just the ones that were always there. It was a slab, solid, square, and impossible to break with a spoon. Chocolate concrete. Just the name sounded like something from a building site. And honestly, it felt like it too. Crunchy on top, dense underneath, and somehow dry and satisfying all at once. Served in generous rectangles that dared your cutlery to make a dent. But then came the twist. A stream of mint custard, pale green and steaming, poured over the top like something from a science experiment. Chocolate and mint, hot and cold, crunchy and smooth. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. There was something thrilling about trying to slice through the concrete, only to end up picking it up like a biscuit and dipping it into the custard. The mint was sweet, cool, almost toothpaste adjacent, but comforting in its own odd way. It coated everything in green warmth, balancing the bite of the chocolate base. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't delicate, but it was unforgettable. Kids would trade half their lunch for a piece, and you always knew who had it first. They were the ones tapping at their tray like archaeologists with a spoon. Years later, you might laugh at the idea, but back then, it was one of the most exciting things on offer. A dessert with character, a pudding with personality, and whether you ate it with a spoon, a fork, or your hands, one thing's certain. Once you've had chocolate concrete, nothing else quite compares. You knew it was Friday the moment you saw them. Fish fingers, laid out in tidy rows, golden and crisp, still sizzling slightly as they were piled onto trays. Next to them, baked beans, sweet, sticky, and just chaotic enough to spill into everything else. It was the meal you actually looked forward to, a reward for making it through spelling tests, assembly, and whatever mystery meat Wednesday had thrown at you. The fish fingers crunched just right on the outside, soft and flaky in the middle. Even if the fish bit was a mystery, no one really questioned. Some kids dipped them straight into beans. Others lined them up and ate them in careful bites. Either way, there was a rhythm to it, a joy, and a full belly that carried you all the way to the weekend. The beans were lava hot, clinging to the fork, dripping onto the mash, and soaking into everything nearby. But somehow, that made it better. A mess worth making. Fish fingers and beans weren't just food, they were a feeling. That final push before freedom. A taste of something familiar, filling, and just indulgent enough to make school seem okay for a little while longer. Maybe you had 5 on your plate, maybe 3. Maybe you bargained with a mate for extras. But one thing's for sure, if there was ever a dish that summed up the best of British school dinners, it was this one. Simple, honest, and still a classic in kitchens up and down the country. It divided the hall like no other. You either loved it or you stared at it, wondering if it was even meant to be food. Rice pudding with skin, a bowl of thick, creamy grains, sweet, warm, and innocent, topped with a golden brown layer that wobbled slightly when touched. For some, that skin was the best part, slightly chewy, slightly toasty, a contrast to the soft rice beneath. They'd fight for the corners, the browned edges, the spots where it clung to the spoon like a secret prize. For others, it was pure horror, peeled off, pushed aside, or, in the bravest cases, swapped for an extra sausage roll. But love it or not, it was iconic. The rice pudding itself was comforting, a gentle sweetness, thick and filling, often spiced faintly with nutmeg or cinnamon if the cooks were feeling fancy. It came in deep trays, steaming, smelling like something from another time. and even those who couldn't face the skin would sneak a bite of the warm, soft rice underneath. It was a dish from another era. Simple, slow-cooked, full of texture and tradition. It might have made you gag back then. But now, it's the kind of thing that takes you straight back to those pale yellow bowls and long wooden tables, the quiet hum of a lunchroom after dessert had been served, and the unspoken question passed from tray to tray. Did you get the skin? It crunched. That was the first thing you noticed. A sticky, golden layer of cornflakes bound together with syrup, sitting proudly on a thick base of short crust pastry. Underneath it all, a thin smear of strawberry jam. Not too much, just enough to give it that unexpected tang. And beside it, a generous helping of custard, usually warm, occasionally lumpy, but always welcome. Cornflake tart wasn't the most elegant dessert, but it felt homemade, as if someone's nan had snuck into the school kitchen with a baking tray. You bit into it, and it was all texture. Crispy top, soft jam, crumbly base. Sweet, but never too sweet. It filled your whole mouth and left your fingers just a bit sticky. Some kids scraped off the flakes. Others saved the custard for the final sweep. But everyone had their way. It was the kind of pudding that brought silence to the lunchroom. A few perfect bites that needed no words. Today, it's a rarity, a memory. But once in a while, someone will bake one for a fundraiser or a retro-themed day, and suddenly you're back at the long tables again, with a spoon in one hand and the day's best dessert in the other. It wasn't fancy, and it definitely wasn't a pie in the traditional sense, but no one cared. Sausage and beans pie was exactly what it sounded like. Cut-up sausages, tinned baked beans, and a crust of mash or puff pastry baked on top until golden and bubbling. It was chaos in a dish, but it was brilliant. The sausages were cheap, bendy, and oddly pink on the inside. The beans were thick with sauce and spread through the tray like molten lava. When it came out of the oven, it looked like something improvised, something born of rationing or a last-minute scramble in the kitchen. And yet, it worked. Kids loved it. It was hot, messy, filling, and comforting. A proper plateful that didn't try to be clever. You didn't need a knife, just a fork and the ability to keep it from spilling over the side of your tray. If you were lucky, you got a bit with the pastry still crispy. If not, it was mash on top, lumpy, browned, and perfect for scooping. No one's mum made it at home. It was strictly a school thing, and that made it special. You only ever had it there, in that clattery, echoey hall, under flickering fluorescent lights, surrounded by mates and noise. And somehow that made it taste better. It was beige, software steaming, and looked like something between a pie and a pudding. Cheese and potato pie. Just the name still brings back the warmth. It was served in big slabs, creamy mash whipped with melted cheese, sometimes with a bit of onion mixed in, baked until golden on top. Occasionally, it came with a short crust pastry base. Often, it stood alone, soft, cheesy, and incredibly filling. It didn't shout for attention. There was no strong spice, no bold sauce, no fancy topping, but it made you feel okay, safe, like everything was going to be fine. One bite and the saltiness hit, followed by the creaminess, the chew of cheese, and the sheer stodge of it all. On a cold day, it warmed your bones. On a rough day, it settled your stomach. It was school dinner comfort at its peak, served with beans or peas, sometimes gravy, depending on who was in the kitchen. And no matter how chaotic the lunch queue or how loud the room, that pie always brought a moment of quiet. You might not crave it now. You might not have thought about it for years. But deep down, if you ever had a forkful of soft, cheesy mash again, you'd remember that feeling, that moment, that pie. They weren't just meals. They were moments, served on beige trays under buzzing lights, shared between yawns, whispers, and the clang of cutlery. British school dinners, strange, simple, unforgettable, left more than just crumbs behind. They carved memories, a spoonful of pink custard, the crunch of concrete cake, the smell of overcooked cabbage drifting into maths class. Somehow, Those dishes stitched themselves into the story of growing up. We didn't always appreciate them then. Some we dreaded, some we traded, some we scraped straight into the bin. But now they hold a strange power, not for their taste, but for what they meant. Routine, comfort, survival, and every now and then, joy, because between the lukewarm mash and the mystery meat, there were little bursts of magic. A bite that tasted like Friday, a dessert that made you feel seen, a ladle of something warm when the day had been cold. School dinners weren't perfect, they weren't glamorous, but they were ours, part of a rhythm, a ritual, a rite of passage. And whether you loved every bite or still wince at the thought of liver and onions, one thing's certain, you'll never forget them. Not really, because food has a way of lingering long after the plates are cleared, and somewhere deep in your memory, there's still a seat at the table, still a tray, still a spoon, and still a flavor that says you were there. If any of these dishes stirred something in you, a taste, a smell, a moment you thought you'd forgotten, then this is your place, a space to remember, to smile, and to share. Let us know in the comments which school dinner lives rent-free in your memory, and if you're the sort who still dreams of butterscotch tart or dreads the skin on rice pudding, you're not alone. Subscribe to join us on more gentle journeys into Britain's past, where the memories might be mushy, but they're never bland.